Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, and our podcast on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. The Horn of Africa is an intriguing part of the world. For centuries, the cultural influences of the Arab and African worlds have blended in this region to form a unique milieu where the influences from one side continue to have an effect on the other, in spite of neither side necessarily wanting to admit to it. It appears as an inconvenient truth. Generally speaking, with the exception of benighted Somalia, the 8 states that form the Horn of Africa region started the 1990s with a sense of optimism. Ethiopia ended its long-running civil war and began rebuilding its society. The government of the late Meles Zenawi created the foundation for a period of stability and economic growth between 1991 and 2012, which saw a country known for its endemic poverty and violence pull itself up by the bootstraps. And even though a war was fought with neighbouring Eritrea between 1998 and 2000, not even this seemed to dampen Ethiopia's rise, while the same could not be said about Eritrea. Kenya, the southernmost of the Horn of African states, while not a democracy in the Western sense of the word, was a stable bastion in East Africa. It projected a sense of what could be accomplished in terms of modern development in spite of ongoing problems of governance and internal security. Prior to 2011, Sudan, as an autocracy, survived largely by the good graces of the aid and trade it received from the Gulf Cooperation states and China, but nothing could prevent the country's south from agitating for independence, which it received as the newly minted state of South Sudan in 2011, divided as it was along ethnic and sectarian lines. Unfortunately, Somalia and the Somali people straddling the borders of Ethiopia and Kenya have proved to be a thorn in the side of the Horn of Africa's economic and social development. Somalia is a failed state. Not even a US military intervention in 1993 could save that country's fortunes, now popularized in the 2001 Hollywood blockbuster Black Hawk Down. The Somali people in Ethiopia and Kenya are a source of political and social instability, harboring militant Islamic extremist groups and groups agitating to join a greater Somalia. This rather brief and incomplete assessment of the Horn of Africa gives a taste of the complexities involved for those who serve there in an external diplomatic and military capacity. For today's topic, we are honoured to be joined by Colonel Sandy Wade OBE, retired. Colonel Wade is an associate of Africa Advisory Partners Limited, specialising in investment advice in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. This follows a recent career as a Defence Attache and then diplomat in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I was fortunate to have met with Colonel Wade while doing some work in Addis Ababa in 2012. Back then, Colonel Wade was military advisor in the EU delegation to the African Union. While Colonel Wade is now retired from government service, he is still working in the Horn of Africa region. His answers to questions asked in this interview should not be interpreted in any way as EU or AU policy. Hello, Sandy, and thanks for joining us on Strategicon.
Hi, good morning.
Look, Sandy, let's start off with Kenya. As East Africa's richest and best developed economy, how do you see the current electoral issues surrounding the Kenyan presidential election rerun due in October between incumbent Uhuru Kenyatta and opposition leader Raila Odinga? As the son of the first president of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, will a sense of entitlement to rule prevent Uhuru Kenyatta from allowing a popular vote to defeat him?
Um, Interesting question. I think sense of entitlement is not quite the right issue, but it's true. I think across Africa that the incumbent has an advantage in the electoral process, and so the advantage in this case lies with Uhuru. But in terms of how the rerun will go, I think people in Kenya and people looking at Kenya were relieved that the worst outcome, which was at least anticipated as a possibility, didn't happen. And they're wondering now, I think, how much of that is still possible for a coming re-election. Whether some of those ethnic and tribal issues, which people were afraid would be used in the process, will raise their heads again.
Can you just explain to our listeners something about the Supreme Court's decision to have this election rerun? I mean, after all, the European Union Electoral Commission, who came in to investigate whether or not everything was held above board in the last presidential election, and they ticked off that everything was okay. So why did the Supreme Court make this decision to upend what would have been considered by international standards a legitimate outcome?
I think I'm not really in a position to comment on the facts of the decision, but I think, as you say, the fact that it in a way challenged the comments by the various electoral observation missions has sort of raised an expectation of a different outcome in a way that perhaps is not necessarily helpful for the forthcoming re-election. I mean, the decision of the court is the court's decision, and I think a part of the whole democratic process has to be accepting decisions of the courts. So, in a way, this decision should be seen as a part of the political maturity of Kenya, rather than necessarily as being a sort of threat to that political and democratic process.
One of the things that strikes me as interesting, observing things from an Australian perspective, is that, when we see the media report on African elections, normally, the journalists kind of indicate that, it's just another African despot that's coming to power, and, there's nothing new to see here. It's just all about corruption and quite frankly, tribalism. So, how much truth does do people on the outside of the system, how much truth do we take stock in these kind of journalistic flights of fancy? I mean, we do know, for instance, that many African states are racked by tribalism. Arguably, it's one of the blights on the African body politic. But in terms of moving forward in a more legitimate way, can a political leader like Uhuru Kenyatta claim to lead all Kenyans, or is he really a product of the tribal internal politics that is practiced in Kenya?
Going to the question of tribalism and African democratic processes, African elections. I mean, one can't get away from the fact of tribal groupings, tribal differences in Africa any more than one can get away from some of the ethnic differences in Europe. So tribalism, if that's the right word, I mean, it's clanism in some places. It's a bit too much of a broad brush term, but you can't get away from ethnic affiliation and politics, and politics is about people representing those who vote for them. If those who vote for you are from the same tribe as you, they're voting for you in order for you to represent them, that's the process. So I think it's unrealistic to expect there's going to come a moment where suddenly Africa forgets its ethnicities, its internal ethnicities in these countries, which at best are a product of non-African processes of country formation. They're a leftover from a previous system in Africa of colonialism. And as a result, countries are filled with different ethnicities, and those ethnicities need representation. So the question then is, can the winner represent all? And I think that's really where the question comes, and where sometimes the proof has been yes and sometimes the proof has been no across Africa. But I think in Kenya the proof in general has been yes. Kenya has done very well on the basis of a government which has, over time, a series of governments which have represented the country, perhaps represented different groups differentially in each case, but not to the point of total exclusion of another group. So I think perhaps Kenya is a good example over time for the rest of Africa. But like the rest of Africa, it does have some serious challenges and issues in its development of democracy, and how representation is taken to Parliament, and how representation works for those who didn't win all the seats.
If we go a little bit further north and staying on the whole tribal theme of things, Ethiopia has gone from stable to unstable in a relatively short period of time. There are some 400,000 Oromos that are now internally displaced from the Somali state of Ethiopia, or otherwise known as Western Somalia or Somali Galbeed, where fighting between Oromos and Somalis is intensifying. Are we seeing the beginnings of a civil war here?
I think the answer to that question is no, and I would slightly challenge the moving from stable to unstable. If you look at Ethiopia over time, Ethiopia has gone from being, in the lifetime of many current Ethiopians, and in the lifetime of the parents and grandparents of nearly all current Ethiopians, Ethiopia has gone from an imperial feudal system through a communist system to a new, perhaps Marxist-based to an extent, or Marxist-based in its earlier leanings system. And it's moved through a series of really quite fundamental changes over that time. And the change has, in general, if you look at it from over that time scale, been beneficial. And for instance, one of the issues that people raise is the ethnic element to federalism in Ethiopia. But if one goes back to when the current constitution was being considered in 1992, 93, and then finalized and agreed in 94, that ethnic representation was essential if Ethiopia was going to remain one country. So there was an enormous achievement in coming to an agreement on a country which stayed together rather than splitting up, as so many other empires have done. And I think it's worth remembering that Ethiopia now is in terms of boundaries, is the Ethiopia of the emperor. It's the last empire in Africa. And so it has internally, inside that external boundary, a very large number of different peoples who are finding a way to live together. But it's not an easy process, and it wouldn't be easy for any government. They have a federal system, and the federal government, the regional governments have certain responsibilities. The federal governments have certain responsibilities. Those rub up against each other sometimes with a bit of friction. But if one looks at the current issue between the Oromos and the Somalis inside Ethiopia, so these are Somali Ethiopians, I mean, I think it's also worth using the terminology of Ethiopia to describe Ethiopia. So the Somali region of Ethiopia is the Somali region of Ethiopia. It's not the Ogaden, it's not Western Somalia, it's the Somali region of Ethiopia. So the border between the Somali region of Ethiopia and the Oromia region of Ethiopia has always been a difficult border. It's a rubbing up of pastoralist Somalis, largely pastoralist Somalis, against largely settled agricultural Oromos. And if you look now at the drought effect in the Horn of Africa, which is affecting the sort of southern third of Ethiopia, which is all of this border between Somali region and Oromia, and it's affecting Somalia, and it's affecting Kenya, and it's affecting Sudan, Uganda, etc. This is putting additional pressure on the livelihoods and the life of the peoples along these borders. And if you're a pastoralist who needs to find pasture, you're going to go where the pasture is. And if you're a settled agriculturalist and somebody comes and brings his cows onto your land, then it creates friction. So there's an additional friction around what is already a long-term issue of where is the boundary between the Oromos and the Somalis in this region. So going back to your stable to unstable, I think this has been a very long-term issue. I mean, if one goes back even, what might seem long-term, back to 2004, to the referendum on which waradas, a warada is a county effectively in Ethiopia, which waradas would be on the Somali side of the border, which would be on the Oromo side of the border. Why was there a referendum in 2004? Because it was already contentious. So, and the outcome of a contentious, if you have a referendum on a contentious issue, you shouldn't be surprised if the outcome is contentious. So that referendum didn't necessarily resolve many of the issues.
You raised a very interesting point about the nature of climate and how it sort of puts pressure on those people who are, just roaming around with cattle against, the various settled communities in the agricultural districts. Do you consider that climate is going to become increasingly a national security issue for the states of the Horn of Africa?
Yes, and it's why the Ethiopian government has made its climate resilient green economy so much a central part of where it's trying to go. The viewpoint of, for instance, the Ethiopian government within the Horn of Africa is that the Horn is particularly vulnerable to changes in climate. They were very engaged, they are very engaged in the Paris process in order to try to convince the rest of the world to take it seriously, because the effect of what's done in the rest of the world is going to happen in their backyard in the Horn of Africa. So, yeah, the whole climate issue is very, very important to the Horn of Africa. And like all of these things, it's not quite as straightforward as one might imagine. It's not just it's getting hotter, it's getting drier. Actually, it's getting wetter in some cases, but the water's arriving in larger quantities in shorter times, which causes flooding and landslides, etc. So, yeah, for the Horn of Africa, climate really is an issue, and slightly exacerbated in its effects by pastoralism, for instance. And I think one will see over time, and I don't think many people would disagree with this, that one will see over time that pastoralism is going to be less of a viable option for the number of people who are currently engaged as pastoralists, and they will gradually move into more settled agricultural life. And I think this is a part of the development process that's going on in the Horn of Africa. There is a need really to make this change into a more settled agricultural economy, for which the principal inputs are there. The land, the people, the water are there. it's a question then of creating the system around which that can work, and part of that's legislative, part of that's bringing investment from outside, a very important part. And much of that will address some of these issues of instability. So I think there are two ways of approaching the creation of stability and security in these developing areas, developing economies, whether it's in Somalia, whether it's in southern Ethiopia, whether it's in northern Kenya. You can either say we will enforce security and then we will bring development, or you can say we will bring development and that will bring security. And I think that must be the approach for the Horn of Africa, is to bring the development. And that's not going to be done just by development agencies. That's going to be done by serious investment.
In 2011, South Sudan's independence was a time of celebration, but the dream of independence has turned into the nightmare of an almost 4-year-old civil war. How has this civil war played into the general instability that is now emerging in the Horn of Africa region?
Well, I think one of the key effects of the instability in South Sudan has been the very large numbers of refugees going into principally Uganda and Ethiopia, the majority into Uganda. The effect that has, we talked about tribalism earlier on, the effect that has on ethnic balances in those regions. So in the Gambela region of Ethiopia, the influx of Nuer refugees from South Sudan changes and has changed the overall balance of numbers between ethnicities. It's flipped the overall balance of numbers between ethnicities in Gambela, the Gambela regional state, so one of the federal states of Ethiopia. And there's a similar sort of pressure in Uganda, although slightly different, because every country's context in terms of its ethnicities and tribal areas, etc., is different. I think there is perhaps a demonstration for the West at the moment of how to accept very large numbers of refugees from your neighbours. Ethiopia and Uganda have both accepted these very large numbers, essentially with open arms and saying, you need help, you need refuge, we will give it. Uganda, if you look at their process of giving land to refugees, is extraordinarily generous in a way. Ethiopia is beginning to look at ways of engaging more refugees in the economic activity of the country. Perhaps there are some lessons there for the West in how to really engage and absorb refugees in a more. But I think in terms of the trajectory of South Sudan, it's difficult to see at the moment how and when South Sudan is going to get out of its current internal difficulties. And I think the international community is looking for a responsible government in South Sudan to really show the leadership for the whole of this new country, and to bring this new country into the international fold as a stable and effective country. And that has been on hold for the last 3-4 years, as you say.
In terms of refugees in the region, you made mention the numbers, and obviously they're significant for countries like Uganda and Ethiopia, countries that aren't necessarily the most developed in Africa, although they are doing their bit in terms of development. This is a net financial drain on them to look after so many refugees. How are they going about this? And is it a case of they're doing the best they can, but the local forces and the local agencies can only do so much, and therefore the refugees will continue to push north into the Mediterranean and push further north into Europe? Is this the kind of cycle that we're seeing at the moment?
No, I don't think so quite. I think the international community does a great deal to assist the countries which are hosting refugees in Africa. So supporting the Somalis in Kenya, the Somalis in Ethiopia, supporting the South Sudanese in Ethiopia, supporting the Eritreans in Ethiopia, etc. So not all of the bill is picked up by the local governments, and not all of the bill is picked up by the international community. So there is always a shortfall between the two. That shortfall puts a certain pressure on refugees, as you say, to perhaps look elsewhere. But I think there is a separate issue, which is that the first place that people go to, and this I think is a very general thing, not directly related to Africa, but the first place that people go to, so the first place across a border where one might seek refuge, is not necessarily the place that people would aspire to end up. And once you're out of your own country, then I think it's natural to look for where will I do best. And that's probably not in your neighbouring country. There are, of course, a proportion who are just waiting to go back home, just waiting to go back to their own country. But there are a proportion who look and say, okay, well, I am out and I don't see myself going back. So then where do I see myself being in this world? Because maybe it's not in my neighbouring country. And that then becomes quite difficult for the international community and the host nations to address, to prevent people moving on. There is an element of sort of natural choice in that move on.
And now we'll take a short break here. You're listening to Strategicon, the podcast of SIA. And that was Tedesse Beleke with his 2017 hit, Kalai. And now we'll return to our discussion on the Horn of Africa region. You are listening to Strategicon. Tell me something, Sandy. Is the Yemeni civil war having any kind of impact on the Horn of Africa region? Because, you know, culturally, Yemen and, dare I say, the Arabian Peninsula has got its ties back into the Horn of Africa. Those ties are centuries old. I mean, is there a sort of flow-on from the instability in Yemen that you're starting to see sort of develop a presence in the Horn with regard to refugees?
I think one of the counterintuitive issues around the current trouble in Yemen is that one might expect that what's effectively a war in Yemen, that war would prevent or discourage the movement of refugees through Yemen to the Middle East. In fact, it seems to have had the opposite effect. The the breakdown of what you might call national security in Yemen has been seen as an opportunity both by smugglers and traffickers and by individuals themselves who wish to move, and in a way that as I say, is fairly counterintuitive, looking at it from a comfortable Western point of view. So the numbers of people transiting through Yemen, going north into the Middle East, has not reduced in the way that one might have thought, and in fact has probably increased somewhat. In terms of Yemenis coming into the Horn of Africa, yes, I mean there are very large numbers of Yemenis who had already business connections in, for instance, Djibouti, in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in Somaliland, and many of them have gone to where their business is, or they have relatives in those countries, and they've gone to live with those relatives. Therefore, what one isn't seeing is what one might expect, Yemeni refugee camps to any great extent in the Horn of Africa, with Yemenis being pushed out of Yemen and appearing in camps. Many are coming to, numbers which are very difficult to get hold of, are coming to the Horn of Africa, but being absorbed by family, by economy, etc. So I think that's different. I mean, otherwise, the effect of, to what extent is the instability in Yemen jumping the Red Sea and jumping the Gulf of Aden, I think is a longer term issue that the international community and the region itself, the Horn of Africa states themselves, need to take very seriously, because if what appears to be a Saudi and Iran proxy conflict in Yemen jumps the Horn of Africa, jumps the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea into the Horn of Africa, then the Horn of Africa may find itself dealing with something that, first of all, it wasn't expecting, and secondly, it's not well equipped to deal with in terms of the political arrangements, the political stability within the Horn of Africa, between Horn of Africa countries at the moment, and the ability then to sort of gather themselves together, probably through something like IGAD, the regional economic community for the Horn of Africa, to really to sort of build on their internal stability and firm themselves up against the sort of threats to their stability which might come from a move of this instability from Yemen across the Gulf of Aden. I think in that regard, if you look at the stability of the Horn as a whole, I think the elephant in the room is the relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And if that can be fixed, then it will make a significant difference to the overall stability and security of the Horn of Africa.
Can it be fixed? I
think it has to be. The question is, how will it be fixed? The international community, through the Algiers Agreement, through the Ethiopia-Eritrea Border Commission, have taken things to a certain point. The Eritreans and the Ethiopians have come to a certain point in agreeing on the outcomes of the Ethiopia-Eritrea Border Commission. The Ethiopians are sometimes quoted as having not accepted the outcome of the Border Commission. That was their very first position, but they have since unreservedly accepted the ruling. The question now is how to make that an agreement that comes into force, into practice. To enforce is the wrong word, but into practice in a way that allows those two countries to regain a sort of normal relationship between them. I think very often you hear individuals from both sides refer to the other as our brother, our sister country, our brother country, our brothers, our sisters. A very close relationship ethnically between the two countries, and yet a sort of stuck relationship politically between the two countries. And somehow that needs to be addressed. I mean, maybe there's a question, if this is a family feud, that's one way of looking at it. The parents have divorced, they've separated, and they have separated. And I think they are not intending to come back together, but they've separated with some outstanding issues not fixed between them, which are affecting the children. And you can see the children as being the populations of those two countries being affected by this divorce, with an acrimonious divorce where some things were never fixed. And you could see the rest of the wider family, the other countries of the Horn of Africa, also being affected by this unhappy separation, which needs some of the issues to be fixed. So I think in that separation process, sometimes people need a marriage guidance counsellor, or they need a lawyer to sit down and manage the discussion between them. And sometimes they can manage it themselves. And I think that's the question for Ethiopia and Eritrea to decide now. Do they need a lawyer to sit between them and help them have that conversation, or can they have it themselves? But I think it's clear to most people who observe the Horn of Africa that these outstanding issues between the two countries need to be fixed for the sake of not only the two countries individually and together, but also for the sake of the rest of the Horn of Africa.
The Nile River system is under threat from on a number of fronts, environmental and man-made. On the one hand, there's Ethiopia's wish to dam the upper reaches of the river system to increase the country's ability to draw hydroelectric power, while also increasing its share of freshwater resources. This, of course, jeopardizes Egypt's access to needed fresh water for irrigation in a land parched by the Sahara. Over the past 10 years, there have been rumors that Egyptian military action might be taken should Ethiopia diminish the Nile's flow of water downstream. Diplomacy has so far calmed tensions, but how real is the prospect of a war between Egypt and Ethiopia over access to the Nile?
I think there is little prospect. In fact, I would say there is no prospect of a war between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Nile. I think there's a much greater prospect of a long-term agreement between those two countries that one of them provides 80-something% of the water in the Nile and the other consumes 80-something% of the water in the Nile. And that demands a certain strategic relationship between the two countries. You talked about the Ethiopian dam and talked about Ethiopia wanting more freshwater resources. In fact, that dam, the Grand Renaissance Dam, is very close to the border with Sudan, and it doesn't provide any additional freshwater resources for Ethiopia, except possibly fisheries. But fisheries won't cause any additional reduction in the water. So the key question, the key period, is going to be over the filling of the dam. If you look at the filling of the Aswan Dam, that took 11 years. This particular year happens to have been a fairly major flow year for the Nile. And had the dam been in a position to start to impound water this year, it's possible that would have allowed Ethiopia a sort of bonus in terms of amount of water they could have taken in one particular year. But the Ethiopians have always said that the filling of the dam will be dependent on various factors, including rainfall, climatic conditions, etc. And the time will change depending on what happens with each of those factors. But I think a greater issue for Egypt is not Ethiopia using the water of the Nile. I mean, even the Ethiopians couldn't stop the Nile even if they wanted to. So the water will continue to flow. But one of the things that the dam will allow is greater irrigation in Sudan. That will increase Sudan's take-up of the available water that might otherwise make its way to Egypt. And I think that three-way relationship between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt is really the sort of key to the future of the Nile. So I talked about a future strategic relationship between Ethiopia and Egypt, but that strategic relationship couldn't be put in place in the absence of considering Sudan as another partner in that process.
Sandy, much has been made of China's influence over the African continent. Arguably, China is the single most important economic player in Africa, since it asks very little of African governments in terms of promotion of human rights, liberal political agendas, and the discontinuation of corruption. With China now having established a naval port in Djibouti, does this signal the end of the soft economic power phase of Chinese expansion into Africa and the projection of its hard military power? Do you expect to see more Chinese military involvement in Africa?
I think that the Chinese base in Djibouti is not so much a naval base as a sort of strategic transit point. I think the numbers of Chinese military who will be there on a sort of permanent basis will be relatively small. The numbers who might come in and out on their way to, for instance, the UN mission in South Sudan would be a more variable, sort of fluctuating figure. I think China's concern in Africa for security is more about its own people who are in Africa now in really quite large numbers than it is about any desire to project power into Africa and project forces into Africa and use Africa as a place in which to contest against the forces of others. So from what I know of it, it seems that the Chinese concern is security of its people, how that might be managed, how a threat to large numbers of Chinese in a particular country might be responded to, and a base in Djibouti, I mean, it happens to be in Djibouti, but it could have been somewhere else, provides them that sort of forward base through which, if, for instance, they had to do what they did, I think in 2000 and I want to say 2013 or 14 probably, when they withdrew quite a large number of contractors from Yemen. Had this base existed in Djibouti, it would have made that a much more manageable process. If you imagine something similar happening in another country in Africa where there are large numbers who need to be brought out, managing that process through a base in Djibouti rather than through a civilian airhead somewhere where there is much less control, much less flexibility, much less capacity to deal with numbers of people, to sort of hold them in order to move them back to China, whatever. I think that's more the intent of this base. Of course, it does also offer them a foothold on the African continent. So one can't see it as being completely just a sort of safety mechanism, because it does provide them that foothold. They are taking a greater part in UN missions in Africa. Is that because they wish to project themselves within the UN, increase their profile within the UN, or is that because those missions are protecting Chinese people in Africa? I think it's an element of each, and an element that will vary over time as to which is the more important.
In many ways, the boundaries of Somalia are no more than a cartographic expression rather than those of an actual working nation state. How would you assess the African Union forces' presence in Somalia? Has it helped or hindered local state building and the creation of civil society?
AMISOM has been a very necessary part of the process of bringing normality back to Somalia. I think the extent to which one could describe AMISOM as being in some way an anti-Islamist operation is difficult quite to say. The culture of Al-Shabaab in Somalia as an Islamist organization and as the principal opponents of the federal government of Somalia and their supporters through the African Union sort of leads to this Islamist versus non-Islamist impression. But I think it's not as simple as that. The eventual solution to security in Somalia is going to come from Somalis. It's not going to be imposed by external African forces or even external Western forces. And I think I talked about the development versus security earlier on. I think for Somalia, this development versus security issue is really the key for the future stability of Somalia. The Somalis are businessmen, they understand business. When stability becomes an essential element of the business model of a Somali businessman in Somalia, then they will work very hard to ensure that stability is in place so the business model works. And that's not yet the case. It's not yet clear that it's essential to bring in tax, to bring in regulation of trade, etc., when the Somali economy has been working very nicely for 20 years in the absence of those things. So there's a line of work to be done by the African Union, by the UN, by the international community, but principally by Somalis, to work towards a functioning economy in Somalia which is dependent on security and stability. And then that security and stability will be provided by Somalis for Somalia.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Sandy. That was a very interesting wrap-up of the Horn of Africa region, a very complex area indeed. And thanks for joining us on this, our 35th episode of Strategicon as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes and SoundCloud, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, Twitter or SoundCloud, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.